Very good morning. I am Bapi Raju from IIIT Hyderabad, and we have a warm welcome to this tutorial on deep neural networks and brain alignment, brain encoding and decoding. Uh, First off, let me, on behalf of all my co-speakers on this tutorial, apologize for not being able to come there physically. Various logistic issues, and we should have planned better. But here we are with the help of a bunch of volunteers, including Preetham, who is there as a host, and later Professor Asif Iqbal and Ankan Malik, who are going to help us host this, and hope we'll have as near to physical tutorial as we can make it, given the scenario. So without much further ado, let me start the proceedings. The agenda for today is this. We have the session is organized in four different sort of segments. The first segment, 1.5 hours before coffee break, I'll start with the basic idea of what functional MRI, what brain recordings are, encoding, decoding, what the problem that we are planning to give solutions for, and followed by Manish, Dr. Manish Gupta from Microsoft India, who is going to present on stimulus representations, and that might spill over after coffee break. Then I'll pick up again for discussing brain decoding solutions. There's a typo here. We'll start with brain decoding today for an hour before lunch break. Then we break for lunch, we come back, and then Dr. Mariya Toneva from Max Planck Institute, she is going to talk about brain encoding. So again, this is a typo. 1.5 hours before coffee break, afternoon coffee break, followed by the last session where we'll discuss advanced methods and summarize the session. And yeah, let me start with the basic introduction and ideas related to brain encoding, decoding techniques, and what are the research goals that we are going to address. In the field of neuroscience, so what we are looking at today is an interdisciplinary sort of approach to combine brain the deep learning models in the service of neuroscience. So field of neuroscience looking at brain function and structure and how they are related, and looking at various questions related to how brain learns both during childhood, adolescence, and how this learning and memory deteriorate over aging. All of these is interesting to see what areas are included, how the structure declines, how the function is most of the function is intact, but some of it declines with age. All these questions are of interest, along with various cognitive functions, memory, attention, decision making, how speech and language are processed in the brain, what areas, and how what is the representation brain uses for representing language, speech, and various other perceptual dimensions, and how they are processed to do higher order cognitive functions like reasoning and so on, planning. And so neuroscientists are interested in these diverse topics, understand the structure and function that subserves these functions. And we would also like to see if any insights that understanding how brain represents could inform deep learning models and AI in general. So, um, so let me then look at the workshop is centered around two main concepts: brain encoding and decoding. And these are very important problems. How does brain encode information? And how is it possible for us to decode the information from brain responses? So the first bullet here is encoding process, the process of learning a mapping E from the stimulus side as stimuli to the brain response. So this is the mapping that we are learning from stimulus representation to predicting brain response, a model that takes in input as stimulus representation, either in the form of um, a categorical information features derived from traditional feature engineering machine learning approaches, or from deep neural networks. You derive representation and map that and see how that maps to predicting brain function. Right, so this is one task, encoding, learning this mapping E that goes from stimulus to brain activation. So the other major task that we are interested is decoding. So given the brain response F, can we predict the stimulus representation? And in some cases, actually reconstruct the stimulus the brain is experiencing, right? So this is the other way around. Given the brain response, can we um, predict the stimulus features, or reconstruct the stimulus itself? That is the decoding task. And the other is mixed sort of other forms of encoding, decoding, where you are doing this encoding, decoding using responses from the participants. Map participants' behavior to the brain response, or from the brain response predict the participant's behavior. It could be, for example, a perceptual stimulus that is given, and they are asked to look at whether they can see what is being shown in a rapid presentation, or they cannot distinguish, or they are unsure. They can see, but they are unsure. Suppose this is a perceptual decision-making task from which the behavior is mapped to brain response, and from the brain response, you are predicting these outcomes. You can also do this among multiple brain activity regions. Right. So to summarize, the encoding is learning a representation from from the stimulus representation to brain response, and we do this typically, for example, using a regression function. You learn the mapping between stimulus representation and the brain response. And in this case, in the decoding case, you are learning this function D that maps brain response to stimulus representation. As these functions E and D can be used to, once you learn them, you can use them to predict either brain activations in the case of encoding, or stimulus features or representation in the case of decoding, for new stimuli that were not used during training. Now, in the next couple of slides, I will take you to how these brain responses are actually recorded. There are, what you show here is a graph. The horizontal axis is temporal resolution, very high temporal resolution, or low numbers here, and which goes into milliseconds or sub-millisecond level, to a coarse temporal resolution, which is of the order of seconds. On the vertical axis, you have again a very high spatial resolution to coarse spatial resolution, measured in terms of millimeters of the cortex from which you can record. So what you see in the yellow are invasive recording approaches, for example, where an electrode is inserted into the cortex in order to look at brain responses. The blue ones are non-invasive responses. For the most part of this tutorial, we are interested in these kind of recordings. or either looking at the electrical or magnetic field from the scalp, EEG or MEG, electroencephalography or magnetoencephalography. And the other is looking at blood flow features from the blood flow and how they change when participants are engaged in a task. And most popular one is the functional magnetic resonance imaging. MRI, I hope most of you are familiar with, is a procedure that is done to look at the structure of your body parts, including brain. But here, the small f here refers to functional MRI. And one of the recent non-invasive techniques is infrared spectroscopy based functional cortical function recording called NIRS or fNIRS. So these are some of the techniques, and so functional MRI and EEG, MEG, and fNIRS are the ones that we will look at. As I told you already, functional MRI has, as per this graph, there's a lower temporal resolution, but very high spatial resolution. And compared to EEG. And fNIRS is sort of a compromise option. And the actual recording device looks something like this. This is a typical MRI scanner with a large magnet into which participants are wheeled in. And in our case, the object of interest is the brain. So when you wheel in, and there are head coils inside that allow you to record brain activation while participants are engaged in tasks. And what is shown below is a functional MRI, processed functional MRI scan, which shows you activation in the posterior part of the brain. This is the front part, and this is the back part, posterior part, where significant activations are indicated by these yellow and red blobs. So functional MRI is very attractive for cognitive neuroscience investigation because it does not involve any invasive procedure. The inherent blood oxygen level dependent contrast, which is inherent within the brain, that is what is used to get an estimate of the function of the brain. Right. So, and hemodynamic response function. So there are a couple of features that we need to be mindful of, that since this procedure looks at blood response, constituents of the blood and how they respond to brain function, there is a delay that is in the recording. So what you see is the activation is actually what happened 5 seconds ago. So these are not sort of instantaneous measurements. This is something to keep track of or keep in mind while designing computational models. So the next issue that we want to look at is what is the goal in this, right? Given these kind of measurements that are available when participants are engaged in tasks. So the cognitive science, especially the computational modeling that is applied in cognitive science research, looks at primarily three aspects. One is predictive accuracy. Can we build models accurate models that aim to that are useful for understanding how brain encodes information and the feature decodability from the neural data. So how accurate these models are and how can we increase the accuracy of these models, predictive accuracy. So this is the one dimension. The other dimension is interpretability of the models thus designed. And can we look at what a convolutional neural network, for example, that models the brain function, what kind of representations that are learned in the layers of these CNNs versus what happens in the actual brain in the visual area. For example, a CNN that is learning visual representation, what kind of deep learning features that are learned versus what is the representation, hierarchical representation, the visual system in the brain. And this interpretability allows us to map what happens in the models to theories of brain function, right? So this is very important sort of dimension when we are making these models. The third dimension obviously is biological plausibility. Of course, is there a concordance between what you are seeing in your deep learning model and what actually is happening in the brain? And incorporate measurement, can we incorporate biologically realistic measurement related considerations when we are, such as, for example, hemodynamic response function. It is possible that this response varies across the cortex, from sensory to motor to association areas. The hemodynamic response function may be different. Can we incorporate this biological fact into the models? This is one concern. The other is that if we build these linear readout models, can we look at what additional computations are incorporated in order for the downstream functions to work, right? So this biological plausibility, predictive accuracy, and interpretability are these dimensions which are important for us. In the next few minutes, 5 or 10 minutes, I'm going to take you into some of the popular data sets and what is the playground for building these models, what is the current availability of variety of data sets and variety of cognitive functions that these data sets correspond to, so that we can now start going into stimulus representations. How do we estimate them? How do we use them to build models? So let me then move on to the different types of stimuli and popular data sets. This is a slide that tells you each bullet corresponds to one modality: text, textual data, visual, auditory, video, and multimodal stimulus data. So here are some data sets, popular data set names: Harry Potter story data set, Zuko EEG data set. These are data sets that look at textual stimuli and how brain responds in participants, either toward word stimuli, sentence stimuli, or paragraph stimuli. And the other ones are visual stimuli. It's basic visual patterns, either binary or much more nuanced, or visual patterns, natural images. There's natural images, WIM1 dataset, Bold 5000 is a dataset name, and so on. And the auditory stimuli, when people are listening to stories, for example, through their auditory system. So we give headphones and they are listening to the story. For example, a narratives data set or a math radio hour is a big data set that's available for us, where the auditory stimulus as well as the brain response from the participants is made available through these repositories. And video data set, where people are watching videos, either this famous Doctor Who BBC show or Japanese ads data set is a video data set, where the stimulus is a video and you are continuously recording brain activity as participants are engaged in this passive viewing task, for example. So the last one is multimodal stimuli, in which they are both the linguistic, the textual representation, and a line drawing of the concept that this word represents. For example, Pereira data set, which we will discuss in more detail when we talk about decoding models and so on. Okay, so in the other dimension is the types of recording, either functional MRI. All these are non-invasive recordings, fMRI, EEG, MEG, fNURS is also, there's one data set that's available, few data sets in the infrared spectroscopy imaging, all these non-invasive. And the sampling rate is another feature which is important. And in some cases, the eye movements when participants are engaged in looking at stimuli, those are also available. And this point we covered the stimulus modality could be any of these. And in some of these cases where the participants are engaged in a memory task, for example, recognize if you have seen this object before, typically called one back task, or a question answering task, or a property generation task, or a natural language understanding task. These data sets can vary along these task dimension. The other is time given to participants and the types of participants, gender wise, or in one of the data sets, we have both the sighted and visually challenged that are actually processing auditory stimuli. And we look at comparative analysis of how the brain representations are different or similar. And how many repetitions of the stimuli that were recorded. And the last one is the language. Are these, which language are these stimuli in? Are these in English or Italian, French, Chinese, Japanese, and so on, the language. So here is a whole list. I'm not going to go through all of them, but highlight one or two of them. This is a data set by our standards, an older one, 2016 data set, where the task given to participants is a property generation task. And the second, Anderson data 2017, where participants are imagining a situation, a noun is given, and they imagine a situation, and while they are doing this imagery task, their brain response is recorded. In another case, movie quality is rated. They view a movie clip and they give a rating on that. So this is the first data set. This where participants are given a stimulus either in the visual form or in the pictorial form or in the auditory form. And they have to, given this stimulus, they have to mentally go through what kind of properties that come to their mind. Right, a pineapple is a fruit and it is sweet and so on. And several participants, both sighted as well as visually challenged, congenitally blind, were given. These recordings are available in this data set. It's put out in 2016. So the next data set is Italian word stimulus data set and the functional MRI recorded. And these words come from two domains, law and music, both abstract as well as more concrete words that come from either law domain or music domain. And participants have to passively look at these, experience these stimuli. Right. So the other is language processing, cognitive language processing Zuko data set, where participants are given material from Wikipedia, where there is a normal reading, but you manipulate the sentiment of the or relations, or they are asked questions about relationships that exist within the stimulus, or the comment about the sentiment of the particular stimulus sentence that is given to them. Right, so this reading speeds, all of this is a EEG data set that is available. EEG as well as eye tracking data set that is made available publicly for us to go. So the next dimension is visual stimulus data. Again, there's a whole host of them. Some of them are highlighted here. Passive viewing data set is an old 2006 data set where people are viewing basic visual patterns. And then in the other case, they are looking at object images, and they either do a one-back task or a passive viewing of natural images or object images. Right, so I'll skip this kind of data set. We are not interested currently. These are basic visual patterns that are given, and participants are asked to remember which pattern they have seen before. And in another task, this Horikawa and Kamitani in 2017, this recorded this data set and made available, where participants are either asked to do in one condition, one back task. Have you seen the current image that you are seeing? Is it repeated from previous trial? Right, so they have to keep monitoring. The other case where they give a cue and a word is highlighted, and during the evaluation period, they need to think of all the properties that that correspond to the highlighted word. And then they need to give how confident they are with the sort of imagination they have exercised on that particular stimulus. Right, so bold 5,000 data looking at a huge collection of, it's a 20-hour functional MRI scans from each participant. It's a really a big effort looking at variety of images from COCO database, ImageNet, Scene Image database. Around 5,000 unique images are given, and participants' data, brain passive viewing data set is collected. Algonauts is actually a challenge that is running almost every year. This is from one of the years where brain encoding challenge, where you have to look at how to predict the brain response when people are viewing images of objects. It's auditory stimulus data set where participants are either passively listening to a narrative. This is the narrative, large data set, 345 second stimulus, 27 diverse stimuli to 345 participants data, massive data set that has been recorded at Princeton from the Princeton group, passively listening to a narrative, spoken narrative. Right, so I'll skip this. In this case, the data set where you are imagining scenarios. There are 26 participant common scenarios from reading, resting, writing, bathing, cooking, housework. These scenarios are given, and you are supposed to visualize what happens in those and what are the attributes of the particular imagination scenario that people have to rate the kind of attributes they experienced. The experiential attributes are rated by the participants. So this is the narrative data set. So finally the video stimulus data set. This is again a rich data set where participants are viewing ads, passively viewing either short clips or Japanese ads. These are taken from either NTT, web or TV ads. And people, 4 types of labels that are associated: scene descriptions, effectiveness indices, preference votes. These are the diverse categories from which these advertisement movies or video clips are taken. Right, so this is Algonauts 2021 challenge data set where short video clips are given, and we have to build models, the brain response corresponding to when subjects are looking at a video like this are provided, and you can now use this data set to constitute encoding and decoding tasks. Right, so the last one is multimodal data set. There's a question answering, passive viewing. I'll talk about this more detail when I discuss decoding models. So let me skip this. This is the 2012 data set from Tom Mitchell's group, who was a pioneer in this domain of encoding and decoding. This is the Pereira data set, where picture and representative sentences that describe this concept, or a word cloud that looks at this different concept and the related words. Right, so brain activity associated with all these stimulus modalities are recorded. The last one, for completeness, I am also showing this fMRI data set, where these optical recordings are done when participants are engaged in audio-visual stimulus processing. Right, so given that we discussed briefly and rapidly various types of data sets, now I hand over to Manish to go into details of how these stimuli could be represented. Yeah, Manish.
Thank you, Professor Bapi. Yeah, I think that was quick and a quick and exhaustive description of various kinds of data sets and the way brain encoding and decoding field has evolved over years, right? I'll basically get started. Let me start by sharing my screen. Hope all is good. So just to sort of give a brief recap of what Professor Bapi sort of covered, we talked about already about an introduction to brain encoding and decoding. So he talked about encoding, which is a process of taking the stimuli and being able to predict your brain activations, right? On the other hand, decoding is the process where you actually take those brain activations and in some ways try to magically identify what this guy would have seen or what this guy is thinking or what this guy has just read and so on, right? So in some ways, it's sort of nothing short of magic, the brain decoding process. And then we talked about various data sets. In fact, we looked at 5 different types of data sets based on modalities: text, visual, audio, video, and other multimodal stimuli. And we also saw how these data sets are obtained in different kinds of settings. So there are fMRI, EEG, MEG settings, and they vary based on how frequently you sample the next brain response, fixation points, so as to actually record them more accurately, forms of different stimuli, what is the active task that the participant is doing, so as to sort of so as to make sure that there is less noise in those recordings. So the participant is actively involved, then the noise is lesser, right? Then how much time is given to participants? What are the kind of participants? Number of times the response to stimuli was recorded? What is the language in which the stimuli is presented? If it's text-based, right? So we looked at these various text stimuli data sets. And so on, right? So essentially, Professor Bapi also went into details about some of these text, visual, audio, video, and multimodal kind of stimulus data sets, right? So while this might have been like, you might have thought that this was sort of a little rushed, but remember that this is just the basis. Each of these data sets, each of these kinds of stimuli, we are going to talk a little bit in more detail over the next few sessions, right? So essentially, for example, in this session, I'm going to talk about stimulus representations. So you have those data sets with different kinds of stimuli, whether it is text, images, or audio or video. How do you represent them? Because once you represent them, you can actually build very simple, small little adapter modules. For example, just let's say ridge regression, and then use them for brain encoding. Similarly, the stimulus representations are also very important when you are trying to decode things. So If you are doing brain decoding, earlier pieces of work specifically did not really decode it to the actual stimuli. So by looking at brain activations, it's not like you will be able to exactly guess what was the actual text that this guy saw, right? Or what was the actual image that this participant actually saw. But what you would be able to guess is a good representation of that image that the participant visualized. So therefore, these stimulus representations play an important role. So in this hour, I will talk about these stimulus representations. And then later, after the coffee break, Professor Bapi Raju, in fact, will come back again, a little bit after the coffee break. I mean, I'm assuming we will still spill over a little after the coffee break. And then Professor Bapi Raju will come back again, and he will talk about brain decoding. So we will get into deep details about each of those methods which have been used to take these stimulus presentations to take the brain recordings and be able to decode them. Some of them just decode back to stimulus representations, while more recent methods have tried to decode back to the original text or images, right? Then we'll have a lunch break and we'll then carry forward with other things like encoding and advanced methods. Okay. So let's start with stimulus representations. And in this hour, I'm going to talk about text-based stimulus representations, visual stimulus representations, audio stimulus representations, and multimodal stimulus representations. Now, IJCAI is in general a very, very broad audience, right? So if you belong to the neuroscience community, specifically to the neuroscience community, you would basically really like the deep details of these stimulus representations. But if you are in the traditional deep learning community, right? So essentially deep learning and machine learning community, and and you have basically already experimented with a whole bunch of these representations, then you might be like, okay, this is a good revision of things. Okay, so either way, what I have tried to do is to sort of make it comfortable for people, both from the deep learning community or machine learning community, and also from the neuroscience community to be able to relate with both sides of the world and therefore look at it from the two perspectives nicely. Okay, so let's get started. So stimulus representations, text stimuli specifically. So this is a key slide where I'm going to talk about a summary of these representations. And of course, in the next few slides, I'm going to double click on each of them. Okay. So text stimuli representation. So remember, a lot of work in neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, has been pretty old. So some of the earlier works, especially in the visual stimulus, date back to 2008. So more than around 15 years old now. So some of these earlier works, basically using the text stimuli, depended on basic NLP representations. So this included corpus co-occurrence counts. So you would just use co-occurrence counts of certain words with some other words and so on. Topic models, linguistic features like part of speech tags, dependency features coming from Stanford dependencies, role-based features, so role-based semantic role labeling, those kinds of features, right? Uh, discourse features. So some of these text data sets essentially are stories. For example, in some of these text stimuli data sets, there's a Harry Potter data set, right? Where you have a Harry Potter story being represented using sentences coming up on the screen one by one. So now can we come up with interesting discourse features out of that? Right? And I will talk in detail about how these discourse features look like. Right? Semantic data sets, semantic features. So in the sense, word embedding methods, and this is basically some things which started almost like 2015, 2016 time period. Right? Word embedding methods, and then more richer methods like sentence representation models, recurrent neural networks, transformer-based methods, and more recently, yes, transformer-based generative methods as well. Right? Then this was, of course, experiential attributes have been used even before these deep learning methods, basically semantic text-based methods started coming up. So experiential attributes essentially are manually curated features which basically involve human ratings which are provided by participants later after the experiments, after the brain recording experiments are done. So these ones are also called as behavioral attributes. And so the idea is that typically when you show some stimuli to participants, yes, I mean, they are in the scanner and you record their brain recordings. However, after that thing is done, you basically also make them sit through a bunch of questions about what they visualized, right? And those questions are the ones that are recorded as experiential attributes and can be used as really good representations of stimulus because they are the things that the participants themselves labeled about the stimulus. Okay. So that's that. And they can be either binary or they can actually be also ratings on a Likert scale, as we'll talk about them in detail later. Okay. There are also other forms of stimuli, like visual stimuli. And earlier methods for visual stimuli representations, of course, depend on filter banks. So visual field filter banks, Gabor-Wavelet pyramids. So, those were the earlier representations in the computer vision field as well. These are 2008, 2010, those kinds of time periods. Right? This was followed by something called as hierarchical max model, HMax model, which I'll briefly talk about later. And then, of course, more recent works all use convolution neural networks. So almost starting from 2012 onwards, so for the past decade or so, all the visual stimuli has been processed using convolution neural networks. Right. Now, the next one is audio stimuli. So audio stimuli, of course, the older methods used standard features like phoneme rate, presence of phonemes, Mel frequency Kapstrom coefficients, right? Mel spectrogram features. So a whole bunch of features which one can sort of in today's world extract from awesome libraries like PyAudio or Librosa, right? But then, of course, more recent methods also depend on deep learning kind of mechanisms like SoundNet, AudioNet, and so on. Then there are multimodal stimuli as well. So in the sense that you basically are shown an image, but then, hey, you're also shown text related to the image. So in that senses, you have to come up with some multimodal representations. And thanks to advancements in deep learning, you have very awesome multimodal models like VisualBERT, WillBERT, LXMERT, clip model very recently, and so many other models which have been coming up in the very recent, in the very recent times, which have been explored so as to come up with really awesome multimodal stimuli representations. Okay. So that's that. Now, that was the key slide. I'll of course double click into each of them and look at them in detail, also in the context of several data sets that have been proposed. Okay, but this could be a very good time to also take up any questions. So I mean, there is a mic in the room. So if you basically have any questions, please feel free to ask at this point, and then we can continue, with the remaining part right after that.
I don't see any hands at the moment.
Okay. Thank you, Preetham. Thank you. So if there are no questions, we'll keep going, and I'll talk about text stimulus representations. Yeah, so as we discussed, text stimulus representations, 4 different types: basic NLP representations. The older ones have been basic NLP representations, and experiential attributes, which are pretty common in that senses. For specific kind of data sets, which are story-based, play-based, those kinds of things, narratives, right? Those kinds of things, they have discourse information as well. So therefore, there are discourse-based features. And then, for more recent things, more recent times, there have been deep learning based representations, right? Now, double clicking into them a little more. Basic NLP representations, as I already mentioned, include corpus co-occurrence counts and topic models like LDA, right? But then there are also linguistic features like part of speech features, semantic role labels, or dependencies, Stanford dependencies. Now, on the other hand, there are also discourse-based features, specifically in Harry Potter kind of data sets, right? So these data sets, these features basically include characters. So the idea is that if the participant in the fMRI scanner was reading a sentence and there were mentions of certain characters, for example, Harry Potter, right? So if you're a Harry Potter fan, you know who Harry is. Or there was mention of other characters like Voldemort. That would basically the hope is that that basically leads to activation of different parts of the brains or intensities of different parts of the brains. Intensities of those activations are different. And that is why people actually use leverage characters also as features, discourse-based features, right? So there are other discourse-based features which are important. For example, motion. So, again, these particular discourse-based features have been chosen from a perspective of finding those kinds of things in the discourse, those kinds of signals in the discourse, which can lead to heavy brain activations, right? So significant brain activations. Remember, although there has been significant progress in the way brain activations are measured, brain activations are still very noisy. And therefore, unless there is a significant change in the activations, measuring it is complex. And therefore, the features need to be, strong enough so as to be able to be predictive of those activations which are measured in a noisy manner. Right? So motion. Motion verbs. So this includes verbs like, eating or sleeping or, even raising a wand or things of that kind. So anything that denotes motion typically leads to more thinking. That is the basic hypothesis. And therefore, people also included motion related words. Now, the third kind of things are speech related words. So these are basically words which are, somebody said something, somebody yelled at someone, somebody, was singing something and so on. So anything to do with speech, right? Those kinds of verbs. Emotions, non-motion verbs, and so on. So several discourse-based features, and I'll again double click into them more later. Deep learning based representations, as we discussed earlier as well, these are representations involving embeddings, slightly longer context in terms of RNNs, LSTMs, and transformer based models. Exponential attributes include ratings on a scale of Likert scale of 0 to 6 and also binary exponential attributes. Okay, so let's look at them in more detail now. So basic NLP representations for word stimuli. Now, in these representations, the idea is to actually come up with the features which can actually represent the text that was presented to the participants. Now, again, in various experiments, text can be presented in different forms. So none of the experiments actually have presented, let's say, the whole paragraph to the reader. So of course, you can present full slides to the reader, but that's not typically what is done. So the way the equipment is, typically you can present one word at a time, or you could basically present maximum a sentence at a time, right? So those have been the typical modes of presentation. Even when words have been presented, some of the presentations, or even if sentences have been presented, some of them basically mandate the sentence is presented for 5 seconds, and the participant looks at the sentence for the entire 5 seconds, while others basically present the sentence based on the reading speed of the participant. So the participant reads the entire sentence and then clicks a button saying I'm done with reading the sentence. Okay. So that's the setting. And under that setting, let's basically understand now these NLP representations. Okay. So corpus co-occurrence counts. So basically, these kinds of features essentially just try to note down how many times any of these 25 verbs occurred. So there are these 25 verbs that you can see. And as you can see, this basically data set was created way back in time. And at that point, people just realized that, hey, maybe I could essentially just look at important verbs and try to correlate them with the activity in the brain, right? So essentially, therefore, these are features related to important verbs that could activate a whole bunch of brain areas. Okay, so that's that. And yes, I mean at that time they did ensure that they take sensory motor activities, actions and so on, actions related to objects, actions related to people and spatial relationships and so on. Okay, so for each verb comma stimulus W pair, what they did was to compute the feature based on some corpus. So for example, if this is Harry Potter kind of stories, you'd basically take the verb and the stimulus word that was there, that was presented along with. So if you have a sentence, you have several stimulus words which are presented, and you take the verb. So C, right? So C is a verb. You would basically take the stimulus word and then use its corpus frequency count. So for example, it could be C magic. And then therefore what you would do is to basically go ahead and then look at the word magic and the word C in the entire Harry Potter story. And based on the number of times it occurs, you are going to use that as a feature, right? So that's that. In fact, other people extended this data set to 985 common English words, they basically tried to include more and more words which can essentially relate to sensory or motor activities. Okay. People also built topic models. So the idea is, the idea is that yes, these are the words which are typically presented to readers. So house, lever, and so on. In fact, the initial experiments focused on nouns more so. So readers, especially when just words were shown rather than sentences, participants were shown nouns. So house was shown. And then clearly, if you are just using 25 verbs in this data set, you would basically have like 25 features for the word house, denoting how many times the word house appears with the word see, with the word hear, with the word listen in the data set from which those particular words were chosen. Right? On the other hand, later down the line, people said maybe you can come up with better representations using topic models. Okay, so for example, if the word airplane was shown, maybe what you could do is to basically get essentially web pages that relate with airplane from Wikipedia. Let's take all web pages which relate with Wikipedia, relate with airplane. So for example, it could be fixed wing aircraft, aircraft cabin, airplane, and so on. And once you have all of those web pages for all of the words that you want to show, let's say you're basically showing 100 words or maybe 500 words as part of this experiment, as part of this data set, you actually get all different Wikipedia articles, and then you do topic modeling on top of them. Topic modeling, as some of you mostly know, there are several different topic models starting from LDA, LSA, Dirichlet processing, Dirichlet kind of model. There's so many models which have come up now. But at that point, people basically used LDA and LSA, latent semantic modeling and latent Dirichlet allocation, right? So those kinds of models. And then they tried to group those words and come up with a good topic representation for every word. Now, remember, before deep learning embeddings came in, those topic representations have been treated as nice semantic representations for words, even in typical natural language processing, right? So therefore, people tried to use these topic models as features for word stimuli. Further, people looked at other kinds of standard NLP features that you could extract about words and sentences. So for example, word length. So maybe, and the idea here was to basically identify if word length is at all related to the activations in the brain that happen, right? When somebody sees a word. So word length could also be used as a feature so as to be able to track those activations more accurately or predict those activations more accurately, right? So is the word related to one of the 28 unique parts of speech tags and 17 unique dependency relationships? So part of speech tags are obvious. There are nouns and there are detailed noun types like common noun, proper noun, and so on. There are verbs, adjectives, and so on. And there's a standard list of part of speech tags. One can basically just obtain the hosted by Pentry Bank, often called as Pentry Bank part of speech tags, right? There's also a standard list of dependency relationships. So if you give a sentence, then it can basically contain, you can look at pairs of words and try to extract semantic relationship between those pairs of words. For example, noun-subject relationship, which basically is a relationship between the main verb of the sentence and the noun. And you can basically try to extract if, if the particular word was involved in one such relationship, the word that was shown. Okay. Position of the word in the sentence. So essentially, you could use the position as a feature itself. Now, again, role-based features could also be defined. And then from a role-based feature perspective, you could have several such features. So is the particular word that was shown at the particular time point, right? Is it a main verb of the sentence? Or is it the agent, right? So basically the subject of the sentence in some ways, or it is the patient or the recipient, more like an object of the sentence. Or is it like the predicate or modifier or complement? So now note that many of them have an overlap with the dependency relationships, and therefore maybe not the same paper will use both the roles and the dependency relationships. But then some cases, the roles are slightly different from the dependency relationships, and therefore they can also be used in complementary ways. Okay, so that's that. Now, looking at discourse-based features, I sort of alluded to them already, right? But then there are other discourse-based features like character names. So, while computing discourse-based features, of course, if you showed sentences, now sentences could also include pronouns for the actual nouns. So he raised his wand. Now he basically, if it refers to Harry, then they also made efforts to ensure that the co-reference resolved them. So so that and then counted the whether a particular character was present or not. Right. Motion related words, as I mentioned already, it's like other kinds of motion, every kind of motion. So fly, manipulate. In fact, there's a very large list of motion related words that they're leveraged as features. Speech related words, so representing the dialogue, anything that represents direct speech between characters. Emotion related words, so it identifies a set of emotions that were felt by the characters, and clearly emotions must be related to the way people think, especially if they are tightly engrossed in the task, right? So many of these data sets have been collected by just passive viewing. Now, passive viewing typically does not raise enough brain activations. In fact, if people are just asked to lie down in a chamber, right, and just look at things, highly likely that they are in their own worlds, thinking about other random things. So therefore, to make it much more accurate and less noisy, over time, people started recording data sets with specific tasks. For example, if you, and this happens even when I teach, right? So students, if you're basically telling students that, hey, at the end of the session, there will be a quiz, and based on the quiz, you'll be graded. People are much more attentive, and they basically just think about what you are showing them. Right? So therefore, in many of these tasks, in many of these experiments, the way the data sets were collected is that at the end of the data set, you'll actually or rather, several times while the data set is being collected, you involve the reader into a particular task. For example, you could ask that, hey, what you see, is it a noun or a verb? Right? So that basically the person is actively thinking about it. And the way the person communicates is by choosing things based on a button press, right? So essentially, they can choose to press, maybe you can do ABCD kind of questions as well, where you can actually ask them to press a particular button for something that you want them to indicate as part of the experiment that is going on, right? So anyway, so in this particular discourse kind of features, well, you can actually measure emotion. You can also come up with the emotions. So does the word is the word that was shown, does it indicate any emotion or not, right? Or in general, other verbs, so which don't relate to any of the things here. So it identifies a set of actions that just occurred frequently, but were distinct from motion, right? So for example, hear, know, see, etc. Right. Now, as I mentioned more recently, in the text world, people have been using deep learning representations, and these deep learning representations started off with embeddings. So just like in natural language processing as well, 2013 Wav2Vec came in, 2014 Glove came in, and then 2016 fast text came in. So there, and then of course 2018 Elmo came in, and after that, of course, there have been like sentence representation models and so on. So same kind of thing happened in the neuroscience community as well. So people started off by saying that, hey, yes, I'm showing these stimuli representations, and I do not want to just capture typical NLP-based features, because the new embedding-based features that have come up are now much more accurate. So therefore, let's basically use embedding-based features, right? So here what you see are some embedding-based features, and then later, as Mariya and Professor Bapi will talk about, these features were sort of then mapped basically using encoding and decoding models to brain stimuli. To brain activations. Okay, but then the kind of features that were used, yes, depending on the time period when the data set was collected and experiments were done, people sort of caught up with advancements in the text-based deep learning community, people used 300-dimensional glove features or NNSE, so non-negative sparse embeddings, 1000-dimension based. Or even using skipgram models, so skipgram Wav2Vec models. In fact, people specifically trained, Italian models as well, because some of these data sets, as Professor Bapi Raju also mentioned, were non-English also. So not everything is just English, although most of these data sets are in English. Some of them are in Japanese, some of them in Italian. So they also came up with Wav2Vec embeddings, specifically skipgram embeddings in this particular case. For such data sets, right? Fast text embeddings. And then, people also try to compare across embeddings, which particular stimulus representation works well. And Of course, most of the experiments, most of these datasets actually contain nouns, but some of these datasets also and many of them also contain verbs. Some of them also contain adjectives. Okay. So what was observed is that typically most of these word embedding kind of representations work really well for nouns, but not that well for verbs. And therefore, people actually still used ConceptNet for verbs, but then they ended up using a whole bunch of these word embedding methods for nouns. Right? And then over time, we will see a whole, almost everyone moving to latest deep learning based methods. Okay. So over time, yes, in 2015, 16 time period, LSTMs and RNNs became very popular, especially in the machine translation field. And then over time, neuroscience community also started leveraging LSTM-based features. This was also the time when people stopped just just showing word stimuli to people, to participants, but actually started showing full sentences. So if you show full sentences, then it was sort of obvious that you would use some sort of a sentence representation. But even if you were showing word stimuli, right? So and showing sentences as word stimuli. So many times sentences were shown just as word stimuli. So you'll show a word and then, maybe pause for, let's say, 500 milliseconds, show the next word, and then show the next word, and so on, right? So that is how sentences were shown to people. Now, whether you show them one word at a time or you show them in one go, using LSTMs or RNNs became obvious. And then people actually also tried out other kinds of setting. I mean, of course, you could basically just give the entire sentence to an LSTM and then come up with a representation using some sort of an LSTM model. It could be an Elmo model. So this is specifically an Elmo model with 2 layers of bi-LSTMs, right? But you could also do some sort of multitask LSTMs. So this is, of course, multitask LSTM predict next word and predict the part of speech of the next word. So in a typical Elmo model, of course, you predict the next word and predict the previous word by using 2 unidirectional LSTMs, one in the forward direction and one in the backward direction. But there are other ways of doing multitasking with LSTMs as well. And in this particular paper, what they did was to try to predict the next word and try to also predict the part of speech tag of the next word. And what I was talking about is this Elmo model where people were trying to also do, use LSTMs, but from a forward direction and backward direction, both of them. So while these multitask LSTMs on the left side were not pre-trained, so remember pre-training was not so popular at that time. So people were trying to build up pre-training. So the left side part is not pre-trained. People were training it, as we go. On the right side, what you observe is that this one was, of course, Elmo is a pre-trained model, and then you would use Elmo with the current data sets so as to essentially predict the context-sensitive representation for every word in the sentence. So that's that. Now, and then people observe that, yes, depending on the context length that you have, usually using a context length of up to 10 words was beneficial. And then usually using, let's say in a 2-layer Elmo, using the higher layer gave better results from a brain decoding perspective. Okay. Of course, over time, there came in several sentence embedding methods. So people started using not just RNNs and LSTMs from a non-pre-trained perspective, but people started using pre-trained representations for sentence embeddings. So earlier methods, basically pre-trained sentence embedding methods, were simple pooling methods. Like if you wanted to come up with a representation for a sentence, you would just take all the words in the sentence and you would basically just do max pooling. So you would take Wav2Vec embeddings and then just take the max for every element. Okay. Or you could do average mean pooling, or you could just concatenate all the representations and then just do some sort of pooling on top of them. Okay. Now, advanced pooling methods came in for sentence embeddings. For example, FastSent, SIF, skip thought, quick thought, InferSent, Jensen, in universal sentence encoder. Many of them over time, and this was permanently 2016 to 2018, because in 2018 BERT came in, and then everything basically, people started believing more in BERT, right? Rather, BERT started showing really awesome results. Okay. This was also the time, essentially 2016, 2018 time period, and of course papers published in 2019 based on those research, right? This was also the time when participants were shown full sentences in one go, no word by word stimuli. People are shown full sentences in one go. This is specifically an image from the Pereira dataset, right? So where people were shown full sentences, and then you wanted to come up with a representation for the full sentence rather than just coming up with word stimulus representations. Okay. So here are sentences, some kind of sentence that were shown. So piano is a popular musical instrument. Pressing a piano key causes and so on. So you can read the sentences, right? So these sentences were chosen in a very specific manner related to certain interesting nouns, or related to certain categories like musical instruments. So but regardless, I mean, the idea is that the stimulus representations started focusing on sentence embeddings. Okay? And then, of course, in later sessions, you will see how various kinds of encoding or decoding models were used along with these sentence representations. And yeah, I mean, people observe that, of course, you can do simple pooling methods. They will not basically, in general, give you really good accuracies. What gives you very good accuracies are more complex structured embedding methods, sentence embedding methods, for example, infercent, which gave very good results. Right? So as I basically sort of tried to organize these sentence embedding methods were completely unstructured models, which basically just involved some sort of simple pooling or advanced pooling methods, but they still built upon word embeddings themselves, while structured models essentially looked at sentences as a whole, trying to model them using RNNs and NLS teams, but pre-training them as well based on some loss functions. For example, next word loss function were prominently used in building these models. Some of them were just built in an unsupervised manner, but while some of them actually had some supervised data also. Right? And then clearly these structured models, specifically the supervised ones, gave really good results. Okay. Here is another comparison of the results that you can obtain if you basically just used Elmo, if you used BERT versus you used Transformer Excel, right? So as time passed by, of course, more interesting models like BERT have started becoming popular. Okay. So what you observe is that, I mean, if you look at the right side picture, in fact, if you look at this picture, here is a comparison across several models, as you see, right? So these are standard pooling methods, average pooling, max pooling. So these methods are effectively not very interesting because they just work at the word level, and then they try to combine information at the word level in an ad hoc manner so as to get sentence representations, right? And then towards the end, what you see are transformer-based methods, Roberta, GPT-2, and BERT, right? In between, you basically see sentence embedding methods, okay? So earlier experiments with these data sets, basically, and then by the way, you see several bars there, right? So those bars basically represent difficulty of the task. Let's put it this way. Of course, Professor Bapi and Mariya will go into details of what those tasks are and so on later. But the idea is that the green bar basically shows you some task which was easy to do, right? The blue bar is a little more complex task, and the orange bar is a more complex task. Y-axis basically shows you the accuracy of predictions and so on in terms of Pearson correlation coefficient with the actual brain activations. Okay. So what you observe from here, at least in the initial experiments, people actually observed that inferent embeddings were better than Roberta or GPT-2 or BERT embeddings. Okay, so this is very fancy. Again, I mean, 2019, 2020 is a time period when transformers had just come in, right? And it was observed that inferent was giving very good results, especially in one of these papers. However, over time, of course, people have observed that, well, this data set was small. There are many other data sets which can actually show you much better results, specifically much better results with transformers, specifically if you tune these transformer-based methods appropriately. Okay. What is also observed, in the neuroscience community widely across several papers is that for transformer-based methods, for example, you see in this BERT picture here. So on the y-axis, you see context length. On the x-axis, you see context length. On the y-axis, you basically see the mean voxel prediction accuracy. So what you observe is that typically, a context of 10 to 15 words gives you really good results. Okay, really good results. Now, the other thing that is not shown in this particular chart is that people have typically observed that the last layer of BERT does not give you the best results in terms of predictions, right? So what gives you really good results is the middle layers. So now, and there is more research being done in terms of trying to correlate the way these transformer-based models encode various linguistic properties versus the way the human, human linguistic system actually encodes these properties, right? But then, of course, there will be more discussions on them late in the later part of the tutorial. Okay, so now people have experimented after that with several other data sets, specifically BERT. So BERT became super popular, and people tried to see if there can be other kinds of loss functions. Of course, BERT and variants of BERT experimented with various loss functions, right? So these loss functions are different pre-training strategies also, right? Like there is MLM, so mass language modeling and next sentence prediction that of course the BERT model incorporates. But then there have been so many other modeling techniques like RTD, so essentially, and several others, right, which have come up. What some folks tried to do is to basically build something called a scrambled LM. So the idea, in fact, there are three different variants that you see here. So the idea in scrambled LM is to basically, it's a language modeling technique, of course. So unlike BERT, which does MLM, or unlike GPT, which does the next word prediction loss, right? What they did was scrambled LM. So the idea is that you randomly shuffle the words from the corpus samples to remove the first order cues to syntactic structure. So you completely destroy the syntactic structure and you give it as input, right? So in LM scrambled, and you create this model called a scrambled LM or LM scrambled, the words are shuffled within sentences. So you still retain the sentence structure and you scramble the words within sentences and you give it as input. And of course, the idea is to predict the well-formatted sentence without scrambling, right, in the correct order. Now notice that, in fact, if I think of it, right, scrambled LM is a good technique. It's an efficient technique because compared to mass language modeling, which tries to compute the loss just based on certain tokens, which are masked, scrambled LM actually computes loss for every token. So from an efficiency perspective, it's pretty efficient in that sense. Okay. They also came up with another variant of scrambled LM, LM scrambled para, where the words are shuffled within their containing paragraphs in the corpus. So you don't really bother about keeping the sentence order also the same. You essentially just shuffle the words totally. I mean, across sentences also. In fact, in this particular Pereira data set, stimuli was also shown as a short paragraph. Like, I mean, this paragraph is not very long. I mean, like maybe like 4 sentences, on average 4 sentences or so. Okay, so that's that. Now, of course, while showing results on brain activations, these papers also contain some results on typical standard NLP tasks. And these tasks are, some of them are from the GLUE benchmark, which is very popular in the natural language processing community. But they also found on brain tasks, on neuroscience tasks, they found that this LM pause model, where you predict only the part of speech of a masked word rather than the word itself, is actually also accurate. So what they found is that, here is the typical LM. So what you see is, in fact, results being shown on one of these data sets, I think the Pereira data set, but 2 different metrics, mean squared error and average rank metric. What you see is the results coming from models which have been fine-tuned in different ways. So LM scrambled para is there, LM scrambled is there. Then there is glove model, there is the standard language model, there is LM pause. LM pause is basically a way of predicting only the part of speech of the masked word rather than the actual word itself. And then there are other models which are fine-tuned on these tasks, right? What they observed is that the mean average rank is basically the smallest with LM scrambled para. I mean, smaller the better in this particular case. Okay, so they found that scrambled language models actually gave them better results. Okay, so scrambled models actually work the best. Okay. Now, again, it has evolved over time. Of course, the language models have also evolved. There are much better models compared to BERT today, like Roberta and Liberta, with different loss functions and also more robustly trained. And now people basically have figured out other models which give better results. But at that point, people observed that rather than just using the standard language modeling losses, if you basically used the scrambled para losses, you would get better results. Okay. More recently, this is a paper that our group has published. More recently, we actually took BERT model, but then we basically, fine-tuned it across different tasks. So we took the BERT model, which has been fine-tuned on natural language inference tasks, took the BERT model, fine-tuned on the paraphrase detection task, took the BERT model and fine-tuned it on sentiment analysis task, summarization task, word sense disambiguation task, several such tasks. And then we tried to see that maybe, one of these tasks is more correlated with the brain activations compared to just using the standard pre-trained BERT to get word representations or sentence representations, right? And what we found is that, yes, that actually works. So we actually found that some of these fine-tuned representations give better results for when we try to do brain decoding and brain encoding. So, I mean, again, I mean, there'll be more discussions on which of them work better and, how they compare later on. But the idea is to tell you that text-based representations have evolved all the way from using basic NLP-based features to using, word embeddings, to using sentence representations, to using transformer-based representations, and not just pre-trained transformer-based representations, but also appropriately fine-tuned on various NLP tasks. And people have tried to find correlations as to which NLP task basically leads to the best encoding and decoding accuracies. Now, people have also tried to use these BERT models with multitasking in multitasking kind of a setup. Now, again, by multitasking, I could mean several things. And in this particular case, I mean trying to use a data set such that for the same stimulus, you have not just the fMRI recordings, but you also have MEG recordings. Okay. As Professor Bapi Raju mentioned in his first in his discussion, right? There are several ways of doing recordings. There are fMRI sensors or or fMRI way of doing recordings. There is MEG, there is EG, and so on. And fortunately, there is a data set where you have both the fMRI recording as well as the MEG recording. And therefore, what you could do is to basically build a BERT model such that you can basically use the CLS representation so as to essentially just record, just to try to predict the fMRI, while you can actually use the pooled embeddings, for example, so as to predict the MEG. Right. Now, again, while you're trying to come up with these kinds of stimuli representations, do you come up with a different stimuli representation for different subjects, or can you basically just use the same stimuli representation across subjects, right? So therefore, people have basically used different kinds of settings. So in some of those cases, they basically fine-tune BERT or not. So basically, you could basically just use the pre-trained BERT, but maybe you could fine tune based on a small part. Maybe, these fMRI recordings are there for one subject. Great. You could probably use small part of it and use it for training, right? And then you fine tune your BERT model so that you can then do testing on the remaining sentences for this same subject, right? So that's one way. And again, you may not care about subjects at all. So you could probably fine tune a global model, and then you can basically just apply it on the test subjects. Let's call it that way, right? So, or you could fine tune based on one representative subject, or you could fine tune on a small part of, small part of the data of one subject and so on. And then, of course, you can do multitask fine tuning as well. So fine tune using fMRI as well as the MEG data. Here is a summary of the results. Basically, they found that fine-tuned models predict fMRI better than vanilla BERT. This is sort of obvious. Some of these results are obvious, but the nice point is that these basically all led to advancements in the way neuroscience works. So in the way people do brain decoding and brain encoding. Okay. So they also observed that relationships between text and brain activity generalize across experiment participants. So you could basically use data from one participant, fine tune on that data, and then leverage it for predictions for other subjects. Now, this is super important because if you're building devices, for understanding certain things, you could basically build devices based on build those training models based on some subjects, and then try to apply it on other people, without having any training being done for them. Right. So in some ways, this reminds me of the way speech-to-text models work. So remember earlier speech-to-text models, if you were using speech-to-text for dictation purpose, let's say in Microsoft Word 10 years back, a Word would tell you that, hey, let me train on your speech, right? Let me train on your voice. And then it will basically try to build a personalized model which will be stored locally on your machine. But today's models are so awesome, right? So and those were days, by the way, right? I mean, this is something that we joke in India a lot, that, hey, man, that guy is trying to fake American accent so that, the American speech recognition model can understand him. But, no longer do we need to do any of those. And that is possible now because today's models now can actually work across subjects. So you can actually train on some subjects, and then still it can generalize on other participants, right? Using MEG data can actually improve fMRI prediction. So multitasking was a good thing to do. So multitask representations typically work better. A single model can be used to predict the fMRI activity across multiple experimental participants. Okay? So that's that. Now, so you didn't really need to train specific models for different participants. You could just use the same model and globally apply it. So that's that. Now, more recent work has also gone into exploring these transformer models from a perspective of what kind of syntactic and what kind of semantic properties from text do various layers of these transformer models capture. Okay, and then can I basically remove some of these properties and then try to see if I can come up with a better representation. Okay. So the idea is that, let's say I have a BERT model, I have a pre-trained BERT model. And the way, of course, the pre-trained BERT model has been trained on the Google News data and Wikipedia data and whatever, right? So it has probably captured some properties. For example, let's say it has captured, let me just pick up some property, right? So it has captured an ability to be able to understand the occurrence of nouns after verbs. Okay, so in sentences where nouns occur after verbs, some sentences, right? It has nicely learned that property. But maybe that property has to do nothing with the way our brain works, right? So maybe that property is completely uncorrelated to the way our brain works. So then can I remove that property? And if I can remove that property from the BERT model, right, then it is quite likely that the stimulus representation that I'll get after removing that property can come up with better brain activation, better brain encoding and brain decoding. Okay, so that is what people did. So people tried to decompose syntax and semantics and various properties in this syntactic properties and semantic properties. By the way, the other reason why people also wanted to do this, right? I mean, removing some properties and then coming up with stimulus representations. The other reason was to also understand which parts of the brain are activated by a property. For example, if you have a property the simplest, dumbest property, length of the word, right? Let's say if you have a model which basically, or length of the sentence for that matter, when you have a sentence-based representation. So which part of the brain really corresponds to length, right? Length property. If you want to understand that, what you could do is to basically use a full pre-trained model, BERT model, and just or even you can fine tune it, right? And then you can use it to figure out brain activations across different voxels in the brain. Okay. Now, then what you could do is to basically somehow try to remove that length property from the BERT representations. And now how that removal is done, of course, Mariya will talk in more details about that. But there are standard ways of removing properties by looking at actually, it's sort of mentioned in briefly here as well. But there are standard ways of removing these properties from various transformer-based models. So if you remove that property, you can try to figure out which parts of the brain were less activated after you remove that property. And that tells you that, yes, this part of the brain really has to do with the length property, because when the length was there in the model representation, you could basically come up with a better prediction of the voxels there. But when the length was not there, you come up with a worse prediction of the voxels in a particular part of the brain. Yeah. So people have tried to therefore come up with the stimulus representations which lack syntax, which lack semantics in a very controlled manner, right? And then this was the time when people also realized that, yes, GPT-2 models and of different layers of GPT-2 models and different layers of these other models like XLNet, Roberta, Albert, BERT, Distal GPT. Yeah, all of them capture these properties nicely. Some part is basically syntactic in nature, some part is semantic in nature. And by looking at the syntactic versus semantic part, you can actually figure out which parts of the brain deal with the syntax in the language versus which parts deal with the semantics in the language. Okay, so we are almost close to taking a break, but then I will quickly basically also discuss about experiential attributes. Now, these are essentially, again, not deep learning oriented. These are hand curated features, very similar to the earlier features that I talked about, but these are not really some things that are automatically computed. So remember, in the first part of the text stimuli representations, I sort of talked about co-occurrence counts, corpus co-occurrence counts, and so on, those kinds of statistical features, which typically people also use in the natural language processing field. But these features, experiential attributes, are more like behavioral attributes, and they are manually curated. So when, just after the fMRI experiment is done, the participant is basically asked to, sit down and look at those things that were shown to them and rate or associate basically the images or text, whatever they saw, in this particular case, text that they saw with a particular feature, with a particular experiential attribute. Okay. So for example, a participant is asked something like this: on a scale of 0 to 6, to what degree do you think a banana is having a characteristic or defining color, right? So essentially, of course, the word banana was also shown, when the brain recordings were being done. So you take those words which were shown when the brain recordings were being done, and then you try to associate them with any of these experiential attributes, right? So can you think about a color when you think about banana, right? Versus when you see the word water, can you think about any color, right? We can't, right? So, or when you see the word honesty, can you think about color? We can't, right? So essentially, the idea is that um, uh, there are so many senses, and these words were chosen, by the way, these experiential attributes are chosen in a very, very smart manner, right? So as you see, these are things that again can, are cognitive in nature. So essentially, they relate to senses, and they require brain processing to be able to understand them, right? So when you see banana, you of course see things. Your visual cortex basically is involved into doing those things. So therefore, the idea was to basically ask people, whatever, banana, can it be related to vision? Can it be related to something that is bright or dark? And not just binary, on a scale of 0 to 6, so that you can actually associate which part of the brain regions might be activated when somebody sees banana as a stimuli. Okay. So that's that. Now, Anderson et al. Actually started using this for the first time. And in fact, most of these data sets are from the same group, right? So essentially 65 attributes to start with, but then later people used extended this to other set of attributes also. But then, what they found was that on top of text models, other kinds of models, this experiential information gave really significant benefits, especially when you were just using typical non-deep learning based NLP features, right? So that's that. And yeah, I mean, the reason was, these features are really very nice. So it is rarely useful to communicate the color of bananas, because it is so what also happened is that on top of text models, a lot of experiential attributes go unstated, right? And therefore these were extra useful. So in general, when you're talking about banana, right, you don't typically talk about yeah, its color is yellow and so on. So therefore, when you get these exponential features, that helped them a lot. But then again, with deep learning, the thing is that deep learning embeddings basically incorporate these kinds of exponential attributes in them already. So therefore, with deep learning methods, nobody uses them, but earlier they were super useful, right? So people extended these attributes, not just, so the people collected not just 0 to 6 scale, but we will also collected binary attribute information. So for example, behavioral data across 42 different neurally possible semantic features. So these include features like, basically social features, mental action, communication, knowledge, and so on. So there are a whole bunch of these dictionary, and people collected in a manual way. They collected this behavioral or experiential information. Okay, so that's the first part. Now, we are about time from a break perspective. And then, after the break, I will probably spend like about half an hour talking about visual stimulus, audio stimulus, and multimodal stimulus. And then I'll hand it over to Professor Bapi Raju to talk about deep learning for brain decoding. And just to remind everyone, after that, Mariya will come in, Professor Mariya from MPI, right? She will basically talk about brain encoding. And then, again, Mariya will continue after the coffee break in the afternoon, talking about advanced methods. And then lastly, Professor Bapi Raju will sort of summarize and talk about future trends.